Greetings from CBC Studio A to our tens of listeners from coast to coast, and welcome to another episode of Discernment Digest, where we seek to help you think better about less. We do that by applying precepts and principles of God's truth to the affairs of everyday life, and we also look at contemporary events from a biblical perspective in an effort to model discernment in how we assess what is happening. Now, if you hear any background noise today on our podcast, it's because just outside the hallowed walls of Studio A, there's a baby shower going on at our church's ministry center. You may or may not hear that, but that'll explain it if you do. In the last episode, I did not do the digest portion where I go through current news items and seek to analyze those through a biblical lens. But this week, if time permits, and I think it may well not, unfortunately, so I promise next episode we will go through the digest portion, but I'm going to lead with a story from this past week and spend a good bit, probably all of our time, looking at it in a bit of depth. One of the dominant stories of this past week was the testimony before Congress of Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has gone from one of the most admired men in the country just a few years ago to undoubtedly one of the most despised today. Now, who is Anthony Fauci? He's 85 years old, and he only retired in 2022 after serving decades as an immunologist in the government's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases department from 1984 to 2022, and as a chief medical advisor to the president from 2021 to 2022. He was one of the world's most frequently cited scientists across all scientific journals from 83 to 2002. In 2008, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his work on AIDS, an AIDS relief program by President George W. Bush. And Fauci is credited with saving tens of millions of lives with his work on AIDS, tens of millions of lives. But today he is accused by some of causing the deaths of up to 1 million Americans due to his prominent role as part of the White House coronavirus task force, especially in 2020 and 2021, the height of the lockdowns and vaccine mandates. Well, he was on Capitol Hill this past week, having been subpoenaed to testify about his role in those matters and about any connection he may have had to the release of the virus itself in Wuhan, China in late 2019, and then it came to America in a big way in March of the next year, and the rest is sad and painful history. So much so that I somewhat hesitate to revisit it. But it's obviously still very much in the news, and many still have very, very strong feelings about what transpired at that time. It involved the closure of churches for a time, including ours, and so it includes issues of government authority, if any, over the affairs of the church and Christians' approach to science as well. And I wrote just a few weeks after the pandemic began in March of 2020, just a few weeks after that, I wrote, I believe the Bible is God's inerrant word, and I believe that science and medicine are gifts from the God of the Bible. In fact, it is God who has made science possible. But unfortunately, far too many Christians see faith as a replacement for science, and far too many scientists believe science supplants religion. During a pandemic, false teaching is not only spiritually dangerous, it may be fatal. So, how should we think about our biblical faith and what science and medicine are telling us? Science is not anti-Christian, even if many scientists are. Bill Nye, the so-called science guy, says, quote, when you go towards science, you go away from religion. Nye then further displays his ignorance of the relationship between faith and science when he says, quote, apparently, people with these deeply held religious beliefs They embrace that whole literal interpretation of the Bible as written in English as a worldview, and at the same time, they accept aspirin, antibiotic drugs, airplanes. But they're able to hold these two worldviews, and this is a mystery, he says. Well, it's only a mystery for someone like Bill Nye, who fails to understand the difference between two very different kinds of science. There is operation science and origin science. Operation science is what we normally associate with scientific inquiry, in which a phenomenon can be, you remember the scientific method perhaps from school, it can be observed, it can be tested, repeated, and confirmed or falsified. Origin science, on the other hand, is sometimes called historical science or forensic science because it looks back rather than observing something that takes place in the present. Origin science is legitimate inquiry, but it's simply not the same as operation science because it fails the very first requirement of the scientific method, namely that a process be observable. By definition, no human was around to observe the first moment of the universe. When Bill Nye talks of aspirin and antibiotic drugs and airplanes, he's speaking of the products of operation science, which Christians not only believe in and practice, but in fact, it was a Christian, Francis Bacon, who was the first to formalize the concept of the scientific method. And Bacon is just one among a long and illustrious group of first-rate scientists who were Christians. Among them are pioneer astronomer Johannes Kepler from the late 16th century, early 17th century, Blaise Pascal, 17th century, Isaac Newton, 17th and 18th century, Michael Faraday, late 18th century and up to the mid-19th century, Alfred North Whitehead, a widely respected mathematician and philosopher, and J. Robert Oppenheimer stressed that modern science was born out of the Christian worldview. Whitehead, in his 1925 book, Science and the Modern World, said that Christianity is the mother of science because of, quote, the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. So God likes science. God has commissioned humanity, in fact, to pursue exhaustive knowledge of his world for his glory and the good of his creatures. He issued the dominion mandate at the beginning of human history, giving us the responsibility and the privilege to, quote, God said, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground, Genesis 1:28. And the Christian worldview encourages scientific inquiry because of its belief in an intelligent creator who has made an orderly world. It would not be possible for science to develop in an irrational world because science is based on the fact that if water boils at 212 degrees today, it's going to boil at 212 degrees tomorrow, and the same thing the next day, and that there are certain laws and regularities that control the universe. This all stems from the Christian concept of the God who created the world, a God who is rational and who created a rational world. God has promised to allow natural processes to continue unabated until Christ comes, thereby allowing for the uniformity necessary for scientific pursuit. After God intervened in the natural world with the flood of Noah's day, he made this promise to allow the machinery of the universe to continue in an orderly fashion. God said, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. Genesis 8:22. So science is very consistent with the Christian worldview. God likes science. He made a world that makes it all possible. Stupidity, on the other hand, is not Christian. Just a week after the pandemic really broke into the open back in March of 2020, on March 15th of that month, a man named Guillermo Maldonado, who calls himself an apostle, urged his congregants to show up for worship services in person saying, quote, "Do you believe God would bring his people to his house to be contagious with a virus?" Well, yeah, perhaps he would if we foolishly do so. Rodney Howard Brown of The River, that's a church in Tampa Bay, Florida, mocked people concerned about the disease as, quote, pansies. In a sermon, Pastor Tony Spell in Louisiana said, quote, "We're going to pass out anointed handkerchiefs to people who may have a fear, who may have a sickness, and we believe that when those anointed handkerchiefs go, that healing virtue is going on them as well." And Jerry Falwell Jr., then the president of Liberty University, called the response to coronavirus, quote, hype and, quote, overreacting. He said, impeachment didn't work, and the Mueller report didn't work, and Article 25, I think he meant amendment, 25th Amendment to the Constitution, that didn't work. And so maybe now this is their next attempt to get Trump, he said. Whoever they are, this is their next attempt to get Trump. That's the kind of, frankly, nonsense that was going on back in 2020 about the virus. And so how is science to be applied in a pandemic? A once in a lifetime, really once in a century. As far as I know, the only thing comparable was almost exactly 100 years before in the epidemic of the flu, sometimes called the Spanish flu of the early 20th century. Since God is the one who created the conditions for science, and since God is the one who issued that dominion mandate I mentioned earlier, and since God is the one who has promised to allow the universe to proceed in an orderly fashion, as he did after the Noahic flood, then we should thank God for those who, in his common grace, give their lives in studying his world and helping us with their findings. Virology is operation science, so Christians should celebrate it, not defy or belittle it. There was a truck that was a truck on the side of which it said, "Jesus is my vaccine," that participated in a protest about the approach that was being taken early on in the pandemic. Jesus is my vaccine. And to that, I say Jesus is your vaccine, but that's not despite science, but because of it. And I suggest we should thank Jesus for it. And then there was the role of government in our lives and separation of church and state. And I wrote, the events of 2020 have forced many Americans to think about government more than perhaps at any other time in our lives. The COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that it's an election year mean that the decisions of government officials play a prominent role in our daily routine. We eagerly await the most recent pronouncements from federal and state health officials, which determine what we can and cannot do, heaping praise or scorn on them, mostly the latter, it seems. And by definition, a pandemic has far-reaching effects because it has the potential to touch everyone and everything, thus the pan meaning all or every. Even churches, which are normally exempt from governmental edicts, have been compelled to grapple with the requirements that are imposed on us. How should Christians receive and react to the impositions of our government? What does the Bible teach regarding government and Christians' responsibility to it? Well, government is God's idea, according to the Bible, and it's given to promote good and restrain the effects of evil. Romans 13:4 says, "The one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer." Now, because of these important and good functions, and because they are working on behalf of God, ultimately, quote, they are God's servants, government officials at whatever level are to be accorded, that same chapter, Romans 13, says they are to be accorded respect and honor. Now, this esteem is a far cry from the contempt with which many of us hold those in office. I confess that I personally succumb to disrespect when I see the behavior of some high officials. But I and we need to remember that while we may disagree with the decisions of our leaders, we are called to do so agreeably. But God has designed his world with several authority-submission relationships. There are parents and children, there are government and its citizens, there are employers and their employees. And in each of these, a subordinate always has the right to disagree with his superior and to engage in what I call respectful appeal. We see this in the example of the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts. When he was unjustly beaten and imprisoned without a trial, he protested that his rights as a Roman citizen had been violated. He also invoked his Roman citizenship on another occasion, exercising his right of appeal to Caesar himself. When he met before Caesar's representative, Paul addressed King Agrippa in the most deferential manner, even though he had been mistreated. He said, "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you. I beg you to listen to me patiently." Acts chapter 26, verses 2 and 3. The respect accorded government officials does not depend on our agreement. In fact, submission assumes there will be times of disagreement, and it does not require that the one in authority be worthy of respect. When Paul said, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established," in Romans 13, the insane and diabolical Nero was the Roman emperor. When Peter commended obedience to masters, he added, quote, "Not only those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh," 1 Peter 2:18. Submission to authority, even bad authority, is reverence for the God who established it. We submit not because we trust the one in authority, but because we trust the God who is above them. Still, Christians always have the right of respectful appeal. When I worked as a computer consultant, I would sometimes disagree with the decisions of those under whom I was working. On more than one occasion, I told my boss, "I owe you the benefit of my best advice. However, I respect your position, so once I've given my opinion, I will submit to your decision, whatever it is." Children, employees, and citizens need to exercise due deference to those in authority. We always have the option of respectful appeal, but once the decision is made, we submit. But what if they are persecuting us? Well, this whole idea of respectful appeal, first, means calling our president or governor or other political leaders by derogatory names is not the Christian way. Though there are exceptions. See Jesus' term for Herod as that fox in Luke 13:32. We have but one president at a time, and he is our president, whether one respects him or not, Democrat or Republican. And likewise, labeling the governor of my state, Michigan, the, quote, wicked witch of the Midwest, as Gretchen Whitmer was called by many, and labeling her that because we disapprove of her decisions is disrespectful and unbiblical. But even if we do not disrespect, are there not times to disobey? Does Scripture require that we always obey the government? Well, the Bible gives only one exception to the obedience rule, and that is when an authority forbids us from doing something the Bible requires, or by extension, requires us to do something the Bible forbids. The apostles were commanded to stop preaching in Jesus' name, but in response, they said famously in Acts 5:29, "We must obey God rather than human beings." The same principle can and should be applied to the government, requiring us to engage in behavior that would violate God's standards in His Word. For example, if the government required medical personnel, even government medical personnel, to perform abortions, a Christian would need to conscientiously object and refuse. The apostles and their message were singled out, targeted for persecution in the book of Acts, and therefore they had no choice but to disobey. And we would have no choice either if and when, as Christians or churches, we are singled out for persecution. But the current requirements back in 2020 for COVID protection are no such thing. Churches are allowed to meet without penalty in every state I'm aware of, with the possible exception at that time of California. Even in my state of Michigan, which gained a reputation early on for draconian measures, churches have always been allowed to meet without fear of penalty per the governor's order, making an exception for houses of worship. But even if a state were to require churches not to gather due to the virus, it would not constitute persecution unless and until churches were being treated differently from like venues. In church, you have 1, an indoor event with 2, people in close proximity, and 3, engaged in activity like singing that can send and receive virus very efficiently. Now, if and when the government allows crowds, for example, for indoor sports, but prohibits churches, we can conclude churches have been targeted. Until then, claiming persecution where there is none, it inadvertently minimizes the cruelty and reality of actual persecution throughout the world. I've met personally with brothers and sisters who have been imprisoned and beaten for their faith. I've seen what real persecution is, and we were not then, and we have not been since, even close. Over the years, I've known of several incidents in which churches have fought the government for ill-conceived reasons. For years, a pastor in Indiana encouraged churches around the country to forego incorporation with the state and to withhold payroll taxes for its employees on separation of church and state grounds. Well, that church accumulated a tax debt of over $6 million, and its property was seized for repayment. In my area, in southeast Michigan, a church refused to comply with building code requirements in the construction of facilities in 2 different locations. The church was rescued from its battle with the local city officials in the first instance when that property was sold to Lowe's Home Improvement for millions of dollars. The church then embarked on a new building campaign in another area nearby, but failed to comply with building codes once again. That half-constructed building was shuttered, and it has sat vacant for over 20 years. The health and safety of the community have long been considered legitimate government concerns, and most churches cooperate fully in those good endeavors. When our church purchased its current facility, as is customary, we had to update many items to bring it into current code compliance, which we happily did for the safety of our members and the community. In that spirit, the novel coronavirus has required our governmental leaders to make many decisions for the protection of our citizens, and churches have rightly sought to partner with them. I wrote to our congregation at the time, with regard to the scriptural norm that God's people meet each Lord's Day, there are obvious exceptions that all of us have observed, such as sickness, inclement weather, power outages, travel, etc. In the case of illness, we sometimes wisely stay away for the sake of others, even when we might feel well enough to attend, because we do not want to transmit our sickness to them. In such instances, we're weighing 2 scriptural requirements: faithful attendance on the one hand and love for neighbor on the other, and we're choosing to put love first. We think the Lord is pleased when we prioritize love for one another and the surrounding community by foregoing gatherings until we are confident that we will not become inadvertent conduits of harm. We were thankful that we were able to add an in-person option to what we were doing for the first few months and continued. Live stream was something new for us, and we continue it now to this day, having started it during the pandemic. We had an FM radio option where folks could park in our parking lot outside and tune into a particular station and listen live, and also be outside but gathered with others from our church. We did all that as early as July of 2020. And those who were able and willing were able to meet in our auditorium again at that time. But whether and when to offer that, and especially back in our auditorium, has always been a wisdom issue. And as with most wisdom issues, where we apply multiple principles to a given situation, there are several valid approaches that can and were taken by other churches and leaders in those churches. But those were days that taxed our ability to discern what was best, to be sure. Because you may remember when this all came out, everyone became an expert or chose their own set of experts to confirm what, frankly, they already wanted to believe. I remember so many things so quickly going viral at that time. A couple of emergency room doctors in, I think it was Bakersfield, California, went viral because they were making claims about the pandemic not really being what it's advertised as. And people who wanted to believe that circulated that. We needed desperately a centralized source of information because otherwise we were going to be the victims of receiving information from all over social media. And our leadership in our church quickly determined that we were going to follow the centralized source that is authorized to give it through the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health. Not saying that all the decisions they made were right. Looking back on it, there were certainly some that they made were wrong, perhaps some egregiously wrong. That wasn't the point. It was just that we have people who are responsible to do that. If we don't choose that, a centralized source, then we'll be the victims of a balkanized approach to trying to make decisions. And we have to remember, and I certainly was keen to the idea that this was something new to everyone, and the folks making the decisions were having to make them in real time, and they were life and death decisions. And so for me, as someone in leadership, for our leadership team, because we know how hard it is to make decisions on behalf of others, especially when they are very important and vital decisions, then we were willing to cut some slack. And so we determined, based upon all of these principles from Romans 13 and showing deference and respect, that we were going to cooperate as much as possible. Now, what that meant was we were going to have to make a admittedly subjective decision about at what point does being separated and not meeting fully as a church together congregationally become a spiritual detriment. And when it becomes a spiritual detriment to our people, then we're going to have to begin to regather. And if that violates what the state is saying at the time, we're not doing so as an in-your-face approach, but we are simply going to have to do what God has told us to do. And if there are any consequences for that, then so be it. But there were all kinds of things you may remember floating around at the time. Why are they opening liquor stores, for example, instead of churches? Well, they weren't opening liquor stores per se. They were allowing to remain open places that had food. And some of those places, yes, were liquor stores. But they weren't open because they were liquor stores. They were open because they had food. We had folks, at their place of employment who were being mandated to have a vaccine, didn't want to have the vaccine once it had come out, and were asking the church's leadership for a letter saying that they have a religious exemption to that. But our leadership team met. We considered that. We had a handful of such requests, but we determined that, in fact, our church has no such belief. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, do not believe. They've had a long-held belief that does not allow them to engage in blood transfusions, for example. But we have no such thing, and I see no such requirement in Scripture that would say that we have a conscientious religious objection to receiving a vaccine. So we had to respectfully decline to do that. And I'm glad to say that the folks in our church who had requested such understood and respected that. Well, back to Fauci then. Fauci became the face of this because of his prominence, because of all the decades of his very good work. But remember, although Fauci was certainly a chief advisor, President Trump made the decisions. And then after that, President Biden. So Fauci and the others could but advise. Trump made the final decisions. Still, this past week, on Monday of this past week, so a week ago from the time many of you will listen to this in its release on Monday, August the 3rd, the previous Monday, the diaries of Anthony Fauci, which he inexplicably and foolishly kept on government servers, were therefore discovered and were the property then of the government. And Robert F. Kennedy, the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, he's the HHS secretary, he got a hold of those and he turned them over to Senator Rand Paul. And Rand Paul has been a very long time critic and vehement critic of Anthony Fauci and all things Anthony Fauci. Now, Rand Paul has a medical background. He's an ophthalmologist. So he is a doctor in that area, but nonetheless, he has a medical background. And he has accused Fauci of engaging in perjury and lying to Congress over the years when Fauci has been asked by Rand Paul, especially, some others, but Rand Paul in particular, whether or not Fauci, in his role as head of this department under the National Institutes of Health, had ever authorized grant money to go for something called gain of function research. Now, I, as a non-scientist, non-medical person myself, I don't necessarily understand all of it, but the gist of it is money going toward laboratory research that would allow, in effect, allow a bioweapon to be created, to allow something to be manipulated in the lab that could result in a danger to the populace for scientific purposes, but nonetheless, there's a danger if it ever escaped the confines of the lab. That's the idea. Critics argue that the National Institutes of Health, in a grant given to an NGO, a non-governmental organization, that they indirectly funneled money to Chinese researchers to enhance bat coronaviruses through this gain-of-function process. And so lawmakers like Rand Paul contended that modifying bat virus spike proteins qualified as gain-of-function research, which increases transmissibility and lethality. Now, Dr. Fauci testified under oath that he did no such thing, but he and others of his colleagues maintained that they did not fund research that created the coronavirus or experiments that met the specific federal definition for a dangerous gain-of-function enhancement. He and other scientists argued that the specific viruses studied under those grants were quite different from that of COVID-19, and therefore he didn't lie. So there's a dispute there. I don't know where the truth is on that. But Fauci was given immunity from prosecution because he was pardoned by President Biden in his final days in office. Biden, you may remember, pardoned his son, gave him a blanket pardon. He did the same thing for Anthony Fauci because he knew that Rand Paul and others had Anthony Fauci in their sights for prosecution. Whether that prosecution is justified or not, again, I'm making no claim because I don't know. But he was called this past week to testify before Rand Paul's committee. This is just a couple of days after these diaries were released, and the diaries really did reveal Anthony Fauci. In those diaries, he was clearly showed himself to be much more narcissistic than certainly any of us who don't know him other than his public image knew anything about. He was very pleased to be the celebrity that he became. He says as much in the diaries. He talks about some of the influence that he was able to have on government officials. So despite the fact that he said, look, I didn't make the decisions, and I've just said ultimately the president did that, but nevertheless, he most definitely had influence over government officials. He talks about in his diaries the mayor of New York at the time, Bill de Blasio, and having a conversation with him and convincing him that he needed to lock things down. And so he definitely did have that influence. He exercised that influence, and he was very happy with himself about the authority that he had and people doing at his beck and call. But there were just so many at the time conspiracies that were going around. It really, really called for discernment. And it was the time that I determined that far too many Christians are not engaging in careful discernment about the things they believe and the conclusions that they draw. I mean, for example, China was in this Wuhan laboratory producing this on purpose and unleashed it on purpose to the world. I would have no doubt that the Chinese government, believe me, is developing bioweapons to poison the world, but not to poison their own people, not to do it in this way. So if it came out of a lab, and there are more and more people who think it did come out of that lab, as opposed to one of the theories, very prominent theories, was an open market in the same city of Wuhan, but it may well have come out of the lab. But if it did, it was a lab leak and an unintentional one from everything that I can tell. But there were people who were just willing and wanted to believe the worst conspiracy theories. And let me give you another example in closing. I engaged just a few months into all of this in the summer of 2020 in a Zoom call with perhaps 15 or 20 other pastors. And the fellow who was at the center of this Zoom call was a pastor in Ontario, Canada. And Canada was very draconian. They were worse than California, which was the worst in the United States. Canada was horrible, and some pastors were arrested. One pastor that I know personally in Western Canada was arrested, went to jail for several days, and it was really horrible. So we had this fellow on talking about his experience just a few months into this. But during the course of that call, it was crystal clear that this pastor was actually looking forward in many ways to this confrontation with the government to make a point. Now, I know that's a heady claim that I'm making, but I am telling you that having participated in that call, listening to him and questioning him very directly, that was his mindset. And that was the mindset of many in the United States and in Canada as well, that they had an antipathy toward their government, and they were looking forward to a confrontation with the government to, in effect, show who's boss, who can tell whom what to do. And I thought then, and I think now, that was not the biblical mindset, a la what I read to you earlier, but that was what we had going on at the time. Hopefully we have learned through all of that, all of us, myself included. Wisdom means application of knowledge, and so we need to know. We have to have information about the issues at hand, but then engage with humility, always in our application, which in itself is a demonstration of discernment. Well, if you have any questions or comments, you can send those to discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.